Let's be real here. Say it, dig it, and analyze it. That's Deep Story. Thanks for tuning into Deep Story. I'm MPT. So, today we're keeping things a little cheap. Didn't buy a physical book. Nope, I'm reading the e-book version. The book is called The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger. Now, I know what you're thinking. That title. A bit much, right? Sounds like me corporate propaganda from a shipping container company. But no, not at all. The author's whole point is this: out of all the inventions humanity cranked out in the 20th century, the humble shipping container deserves a top spot because it seriously boosted productivity and totally transformed global wealth. Oh, wait a minute. Hold up. Is that conclusion just a little over the top? I mean, think about it. Technologically, shipping containers are meh at best. I'm pretty sure even 19th century blacksmiths could bang out an iron box like that without breaking a sweat. Honestly, a container probably has less tech it than a can of sew up. Sew up cans have to deal with sealing, vacuum packing, that's science, shipping containers. Nah, just toss me metal together, call it a day. Now, we've all heard the saying, knowledge is power, right? Great quote. Love it. But let me tell you something: that does not mean that the more high tech a product is, the more it'll revolutionize productivity. Those two ideas. Totally unrelated. Here's an example: the steam engine. If you surveyed a bunch of smart folks and asked them, what's the most important invention of the last few hundred years? The steam engine would be right up there, no question. But fun fact too, the steam engine wasn't even all that high tech when it first came out. And let's clear up a common myth while we're at it: James Watt didn't actually invent the steam engine. What? Uh, I know, shocking. Watt just improved it. The steam engine was already around in medieval Europe. Ever heard of the Newcomen steam engine? It was used in coal mines to pump water. Watt wasn't me genius scientist. He was a clever engineer, smart guy, sure, and definitely a sharp businessman. He just tweaked the design, made it more efficient, fixed up the mechanics, and boom, history was made. But here's the kicker: this relatively low tech invention became the cornerstone of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, when we talk about industrial societies, the Industrial Revolution, modernity itself, it all traces back to this one thing. So, now we've got the steam engine and the shipping container, two pretty basic inventions. And they're throwing us a curveball. We know technology drives productivity, but what kind of technology makes the biggest impact? That's the $1 million question. And if you're a curious innovator in today's world, especially in a place like China, that's the kind of question that keeps you up at night. But let's park that thought for a second and circle back to the shipping container. Who's the guy behind it? The so called father of the shipping container. His name was Malcolm McLean. He was an American born in North Carolina from a poor family, classic rags to riches setup folks. He didn't have much education, so he started thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And like any ambitious teenager, he decided to become a truck driver. Because, hey, what's cooler than cruising down the highway in a big rig? By the time he was 22, this guy was already killing it. He owned a trucking company, big operation, to haul trucks. But here's the thing: Malcolm was a born hustler. He had that golden business touch. By 1940, things were really popping off. now, quick history refresher, this was right before America jumped into World War II. So, the economy was booming, logistics and transportation were hot industries, and McLean's trucking business was raking it in. That year alone, he pulled in $220,000. And let's not forget that's 1940 money. That was serious cash. By the end of the war, his company was one of the biggest in the entire country. This guy, Malcolm McLean, was a genius. And let me tell ya, one of the easiest ways to spot a business genius. Watch how they cut costs. Cutting costs is like the ultimate entrepreneurial instinct. But here's the catch. I'm not talking about being cheap or squeezing your workers dry. Like, hey, no overtime pay, but here's a pizza party. Ah, that's not cost cutting. That's just being a jerk. True cost cutting. It's about creatively rethinking how resources work together across society to find the most efficient, smartest way to save money. A take Carlos Ghosn, the guy who ran Nissan. They called him the Cost Killer. And no, he didn't get that nickname by slashing employee wages or skimping on office coffee. He did something wild. He went straight to Nissan suppliers and said, "Hey, I'm not here to squeeze you for lower prices. I'm here to help you cut your costs." He literally worked with his suppliers to make their processes more efficient, saved them money, and then got cheaper materials as a result. Nissan's costs went down, profits went up. That's the kind of genius we're talking about. And Malcolm McLean, he had that same gift. This guy could sniff out a way to save money like a bloodhound. Here's one example. Most trucking companies let their drivers fill up at any gas station, hand in the receipt, and get reimbursed. Simple, right? Not for McLean. He personally negotiated deals with gas stations along the highways his trucks used. He'd go station to station, hammering out the best discounts, and then tell his drivers, "From now on, you're only filling up here." Sure, the drivers probably grumbled about it, but McLean's company saved a ton of money and grew like crazy. Now, speaking of cutting costs, let me tell you about a logistics company in the US. I won't name names. It's not a free ad, but their cost saving obsession is on another level. They actually train their truck drivers on how to hold their keys. I'm not kidding. They taught them the fastest way to unlock the truck so they could save a couple of seconds every trip. Yeah, that level of nit, picky efficiency. And that's where the real competition is. Those tiny optimizations add up to big savings. McLean was a master of that kind of thinking. He didn't let a single cost cutting opportunity slip by. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The idea that would eventually lead to the shipping container popped into his head in 1953. His trucking company mostly operated along the East Coast, running up and down the Atlantic. But the highways were a nightmare, always jammed with traffic. Trucks were just sitting there, wasting time and fuel. McLean starts thinking, what if I could skip the highways altogether? What if I just loaded my trucks onto a ship, sailed them to their destination, and then unloaded them on the other end? Boom! Truck on a ship concept was born. Of course, having the idea was the easy part. Turning it into reality, that was a whole other ballgame. The biggest challenge, regulations. Back then, the US government was all about strict market controls. Railroads were railroads, highways were highways, and shipping was shipping. You couldn't just mix and match. But McLean wasn't the kind of guy to let a little thing like government regulations stand in his way. So he came up with a workaround mergers and acquisitions. If he couldn't mix transportation modes directly, he'd just buy a shipping company. And wouldn't you know it? Right around then, the US government was selling off a bunch of surplus ships from World War II. These were called Liberty ships. Da, not the prettiest things, kind of ugly, actually, but super practical. They were mass produced using prefabricated parts, and the production process was insane. At peak efficiency, they were cranking out one of these 7,000-ton ships every 42 days. Over the course of the war, the US built nearly 3,000 of these things. So, post war, there were a ton of them flooding the market, and competition among shipping companies was brutal. Many of them couldn't survive. McLean zeroed in on a struggling company called Pan Atlantic Steamship Corporation and decided to buy it. His logic was simple. If I own the shipping company, no one can stop me from loading my trucks onto ships. A genius, right? He completed the acquisition and then sold off his trucking company, even stepped down from its board. In one brilliant move, he went from being the king of the road to the master of the seas. So, McLean originally thought he had it all figured out. Just stick the whole truck on the ship. Easy, right? But then he took a step back and was like, wait a second, this is dumb. Why am I shipping the whole truck? I don't need the cab on the ship, just the trailer. Genius move. Ditch the truck cab, and now you've got more space for actual goods. At the destination, just hook the trailer up to a new truck cab, and boom, you're back in business. Efficiency, baby. But wait, he wasn't done. McLean kept thinking, you know what? I don't even need the wheels. Let's lose those too. And that's when the light bulb went off. Just pack the goods into a big metal box and stack those suckers up. That's the birth of the shipping container. And stacking, oh man, that was the game changer. Before, you could only lay trailers flat, but now you've got towers of containers. Modern container ships. They're like 1,000-foot long floating Tetris games with containers stacked 10 to 20 wide and 7 or 8 high on the deck, and the same below deck. A one ship can carry over 3,000 containers. That's a lot of stuff, my friends. And it all started with McLean asking, why the hell am I shipping wheels? Of course, to turn this idea into reality, McLean realized he needed more than a vision. He needed cash. And we're not talking chump change. He needed $42 million to take full control of the shipping routes along the Atlantic by buying out Pan Atlantic's parent company. You know how much he had? A whooping $10,000. Yep, that's all. So, what did he do? He created one of the first ever leveraged buyouts in history. Think about that. This guy basically invented a whole financial strategy just to make his dream happen. He went to National City Bank, later known as Citibank, and pitched his idea to a loan officer named Liston. Now, Liston wasn't a bigwig, but he had killer instincts. He thought, this could be huge. But to greenlight the loan, he had to convince two top Wall Street executives. So Liston tells McLean, you gotta head to New York and sell these guys on it yourself. And McLean, oh, he nailed it. He went to Wall Street, gave a pitch so good it probably deserved an Oscar, and convinced the execs to back him. As he's leaving, McLean turns to them and says, by the way, that Liston guy, someday he's gonna be your boss. And guess what? He was right. National City Bank became Citibank, the biggest bank in the world, and Liston went on to become its president. Talk about calling your shots. With the loan secured, McLean got to work. But, of course, nothing ever goes smoothly in these stories. At one point during the acquisition, they needed to gather enough shareholders to meet the legal minimum for a vote, and they were one person short. What did McLean's lawyer do? He ran down to the street, grabbed me random guy, and said, "Hey, wanna make $50?" The guy's like, Sure, what's the catch?" Lawyer's like, "Just come upstairs." Next thing you know, this dude is a board member for 20 minutes, casts the deciding vote, and McLean's deal goes through. Can you imagine? Honey, you'll never guess what happened today. I got paid $50 to sell a shipping company. Now, this whole story boils down to one thing. When an entrepreneur sees a massive, forward looking opportunity, they go all in. No hesitation, no holding back. Like a wolf spotting its prey. And McLean, he was a wolf. And boy, was he right. To prove how revolutionary his container idea was, he teamed up with the Port Authority in New York for an experiment. They compared the cost of shipping beer two ways. First, the old school way, loose cargo. Load the beer onto a truck, unload it at the port, reload it onto the ship, then reverse the whole process at the destination. Cost per ton, $4. Then they tried it with containers. Pack the beer in the box, close the door, load the container onto the ship, done. Cost per ton, 20 cents. Yeah, you heard that right. 20 cents. That's a 95% cost reduction. 95%. At that point, it was game over. A whole new era of global shipping had just been unlocked. All because one guy looked at a truck and thought, do we really need the wheels? So, on April 26, 1956, the first ever container ship, the Ideal X, set sail, and boom, just like that, the shipping industry entered a whole new era. This was a game changer, folks. A massive leap forward. But now you're probably wondering, how does this tie back to the big question I asked earlier? What kind of technology truly supercharges productivity? To answer that, we gotta talk about another guy. And funny enough, his name was also Mickey McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan. This guy wasn't a businessman, though. He was a Canadian scholar, and calling him a telecommunications expert. Man, that's selling him short. This dude was a philosopher, a big picture thinker. Ever heard the term global village? That's him. He came up with it. And his ideas, they've shaped how we understand human civilization itself. Take one of his most famous concepts, extensions of man. Sounds fancy, right? But really, it's just a whole new way of looking at history. McLuhan said all of human progress is just us figuring out how to extend our bodies with technology, like a TV. That's just an extension of your eyes. Cars, they're your legs on steroids. A washing machine, your hands, but better. And earbuds or a boombox, those are just upgrades to your ears. Once you start thinking about technology as body extensions, you can re-evaluate the true value of any invention. Now let's take a little stroll through history. Why did human civilization explode after we entered the agricultural age? It's simply humans extended themselves. Before farming, we were basically just hunting and gathering, working with nature on a find it and eat it basis. But farming, that's when we started working with plants in a structured, collaborative way. And herding, that's farming's animal cousin. So, when humans learned how to extend, their relationships with other living species, civilizations started booming. This same logic explains why the steam engine was such a big deal. Sure, it wasn't flashy in terms of tech. It wasn't like the iPhone of its time. But what it did do was extend humanity's reach in a profound way. It connected us to the ancient, stored energy of fossilized plants, coal. Think about it. The steam engine was basically the router of the Industrial Revolution. It connected long, dead plants to living humans, creating an explosion of power and productivity. That's why it mattered so much. And this brings us to the internet. Why is it so transformative? Same story, it extends us, creates new connections, and opens up possibilities we couldn't imagine before. The internet is just another chapter in the high extensions of man story. So, circling back to our big question, knowledge is power. Sure, but what kind of technology actually drives productivity? Here's the answer: the technologies that change how we connect with resources and the ones that slash connection costs. Those are the real productivity superstars. Now, let's get back to the container story because what happened after its invention is fascinating. It's like throwing a stone into a pond, the ripples go everywhere. And the funny thing is, the people who create these innovations often have no idea what kind of waves they're unleashing. Containers, the internet, their stories play out in shockingly similar ways. All right, back to containers. The first big result of the container revolution. It didn't make any money. Yeah, you heard me. Zero. Zilch. Not a dime. Can you believe that? Even McLean himself, the guy who practically bet his life on this idea, didn't see this coming. From the maiden voyage of the Ideal X in 1956 all the way through the 1960s, his company barely made a profit. But wait, you're probably thinking, hold on, didn't we just talk about that test run? Containers cut shipping costs by 95%. How the heck is that not a license to print money? Great question. And let me tell you, the answer is a wild ride. Here's the thing about innovation: it's never just about the invention itself, it's about how the entire system around it works, or in most cases, doesn't work. Take the container, for example. When people first started using it, it was a total mess. You'd have a ship with a handful of containers, but the rest of the cargo was still loose. So, when the ship docked, you still needed dock workers to haul all that loose cargo off by hand. Only after the ship was mostly emptied would they finally unload a few containers with a crane. Did that save time? Nope. The ship was sitting at the dock just as long as before. And cities? Oh, they were even worse. People were cramming all kinds of random junk into these containers. You'd have a bunch of boxes for mom and pop shops, all packed together in one container. When it got to the destination, they'd pop it open and start pulling everything out one package at a time, just to send it to a dozen different places. I mean, come on, that's not efficiency, that's chaos in a box. Then there were the infrastructure problems: roads, bridges, tunnels, trucks, cranes. None of it was built with containers in mind. The whole system was out of sync. And don't even get me started on theft. At one of McLean's docks in Puerto Rico, the locals took one look at these containers and thought, this is brilliant. Instant steel frame housing. Next thing you know, dozens of them were stolen and hauled off to the slums. Those containers became luxury villas in the shantytown. The real issue was this: society just wasn't ready to see the container's potential. McLean had this groundbreaking idea, but the world around him wasn't equipped to support it. And this isn't unique to containers. It's the story of almost every major innovation. Think about AI. Artificial intelligence has been around as an idea for over 60 years. It started with researchers at Stanford, then MIT jumped in, and for decades it was just nothing. People called it a scam, a money pit. Why? Because the ecosystem wasn't ready yet. No GPUs, no advanced algorithms, no big data pipelines. AI was like a Ferrari with no gas. Then ChatGPT shows up, and now everyone's like, oh my god, AI is amazing. But let's not forget the decades of work IBM, Google, and countless researchers put in. They weren't wrong, they were just early. Same thing with the container. You think McLean was the first guy to come up with this idea? Nah, people had been thinking about putting goods in boxes to save money for decades. It's obvious, right? It doesn't take a genius to see that putting stuff in a box is efficient. And McLean didn't even invent the first container. He bought his first batch. So, other company had been selling them for years and barely managed to move 200 units. So, why is McLean the one we call the father of the container? Timing, timing. He wasn't just right. He was right when the world was finally ready. So, when did the world finally get its act together? The late 1960s, around 1967 to be exact. Now, what was happening in 1967? Vietnam. The US was knee deep in the war, shipping massive amounts of supplies across the Pacific. Suddenly, the military cared a lot about efficiency. They started tweaking their logistic systems and figured out the best way to use containers. They came up with what they called the 3C rule: one container, one type of cargo, one destination. Simple, right? But it was revolutionary. If you're shipping Coca Cola, for example, you fill one container with nothing but Coke, send it to one location, and boom, efficiency skyrockets. By 1967, McLean was back on top. Just a year earlier, his company was bleeding money. But in 67, he made $450 million off a single contract with the Department of Defense. That's when the container revolution exploded. It went from neat idea to global game changer practically overnight. But here's the kicker: the second big consequence of the container was how it flipped people's lives upside down. It reshaped the entire shipping industry, and not everyone was happy about it. Guess who got hit the hardest? Dock workers. Yeah, you didn't need as many guys hauling sacks of rice or crates of beer anymore. Dock workers saw the writing on the wall and fought back hard. And can you blame them? The container was a job killer for their entire profession. Now, let's talk about dock workers. These folks, man, they were a special breed in the working class. Why? Because their job was straight up brutal. I mean, the stuff they had to lift: bags weighing dozens of kilos, copper ingots, steel bars, whole pieces of heavy machinery. You name it, they hauled it. After a day on the docks, their backs probably looked like parentheses, just permanently bent. And for all that back-breaking labor, dock workers had almost zero social status. There was a survey done in Britain ranking 30 different jobs, and guess what? Dock workers came in second to last. Number 29 out of 30. Och! They also lived in slums near the docks, packed together in rough neighborhoods, scraping by. So, what did they do? They stuck together. That's why when we picture dock workers, we imagine these burly guys with big muscles, tough attitudes, and a serious sense of solidarity. And sure, solidarity is the polite way to put it. You could also Say they had a bit of a reputation, brawling, rowdy, maybe not the friendliest to outsiders. But can you blame them? They were poor, they were tough, and they were fighting for survival. And their job, completely unpredictable. When the economy was booming, the ships came rolling in, and there was plenty of work. But during slow times, the docks were empty and the workers had nothing. So, what did they do? They doubled down on family ties. Dock working became this multi generational thing. Dads, uncles, so nephews, grandsons, all working the same docks. If you're in, you're in. And together they formed so me of the strongest, most stubborn unions you could imagine. And after World War II, the dock workers' unions in New York were legendary, and not in a good way. They'd strike at the drop of a hat, shutting down the entire port. Sometimes they'd even throw down with other unions, like the truck drivers, negotiating with these guys. Forget about it. They demanded contracts so one-sided it'd make your head spin. Here's an example. There was this rule that if a ship owner hired one dock worker, they had to pay that guy from the moment the ship docked until it left, whether there was work to do or not. Didn't matter if the guy was sitting around twiddling his thumbs. His paycheck was guaranteed until that ship sailed. Crazy, right? But dock workers had the muscle to back it up. Now, even before containers came along, people had been trying to modernize dock work to cut costs. The first big idea wasn't containers, it was pallets. Yeah, simple wooden pallets. The plan was to stack a bunch of cargo on a pallet, lift the whole thing with a crane, and drop it into the ship's hold. Easy, efficient, cost saving, but the dock workers, oh, they weren't having it. They saw those pallets as job, stealing labor, cutting villains. So, the unions came up with a little gem called the sack pocket rule. Here's how it worked. If you wanted to use a pallet, fine. But first, the dock workers had to unload everything of your pallet and load it onto their own pallet. Then, and only then, could they move it onto the ship. Oh, and once it was in the hold, they'd do the whole process in reverse. It was so inefficient the ship owners were like, forget it. Using pallets just makes everything worse. But then came the container. And when dock workers saw it for the first time, they were like, oh, hell no. This thing makes pallets look like child's play. The unions were furious. They knew the container wasn't just going to steal their jobs, it was going to wipe them out completely. So they rallied together with a simple slogan: we want a share of the modernized machinery's profits. And guess what? The capitalists caved. They realized that fighting the unions would lead to endless strikes and chaos. So they cut a deal. The dock workers got their share. The containers got rolling, and just like that, modern shipping started to take shape. So, why did dock workers eventually agree to the container revolution? Three reasons. First off, they had no idea how big this thing was gonna get. I mean, they thought it was just another gadget, like Pallets 2.0, but containers. Oh no, these weren't just a dockside innovation. They were a full blown factory to doorstep system wide revolution. From the moment a product left the factory to when it showed up on someone's front porch, the container streamlined the whole process. The dock workers couldn't see that coming. They figured it was just another way to make lifting heavy stuff slightly easier. Nope, this was industrial rocket fuel. Second reason, McLean was sneaky. He knew how to sweeten the deal. You know what he offered the dock workers? A cut of the profits. He went, for every container I move, I'll throw in 35 cents for you guys. That's between 35 cents and a whole dollar per container. What I say? The dock workers did so, me quick math. Well, maybe not that quick, and realized that added up to about 30 million a year for their union. And the best part, they didn't have to lift a single bag of rice to earn it. To them, it sounded like free money. But McLean knew the truth. Containers were generating so much value that even after paying off the dock workers, ship owners were pocketing an extra $60 million annually. Everyone wins, right? More money on the table, fewer fights to break out. And the third reason, the new jobs. Sure, the traditional backbreaking work of dock labor was gone, but the ports, they transformed into something out of a science fiction movie. Suddenly, you had jobs for crane operators, computer techs, maintenance crews. And let's face it, dock workers weren't blind to the fact that these new jobs were a lot cushier than what they were used to. I mean, a dock worker's dad might say, "All right, I'm out of work, but my kid's got a steady gig running a crane, and he's not wrecking his back doing it." It wasn't exactly white collar, but it was a step up. So, yeah, the resistance started to fade. But here's the twist. While dock workers adjusted and made peace with the change, there was another group of folks who got totally blindsided. Sailors. That's right, the guys on the ships. Think about it too back in the day. When a ship docked, the crew had days to hang out. First thing they'd do, hit the bars, blow off so, me steam, maybe flirt with a few locals. You know, sailor stuff. Why? Because unloading a ship by hand took forever. But in the container era, oh no, you pull into port, and those giant cranes start working their magic, 30, 40 containers a minute. And it's not just one crane. At modern ports, you've got multiple cranes running at the same time. One's unloading while the other's loading. A massive ship carrying 3,000 containers can be in and out in a day or even just a few hours. Now, you might think, okay, so what? A couple of hours saved. But for the shipping companies, that's huge. Those ships cost a fortune, and most of that money comes from loans. Someone crunched the numbers and figured out that 75% of shipping costs are just loan interest. Every extra day a ship spends in port is burning money. So the second the cranes finish, that ship's gotta go. And guess who suffers? The sailors. These poor guys spend a month at sea dreaming of hitting dry land, and when they finally get there, sorry, boys, no time for bars or barmaids. Just stretch your legs on the dock and get back on board. We're leaving. The psychological toll. It's rough. You're stuck on a ship full of dudes, nothing but ocean in sight, and the one chance to escape that floating prison. Gone in a few hours. This is the social ripple effect of big innovation. Nobody sees it coming. It's like the internet, right? At first, it was just email and chat rooms. Seemed harmless enough. But then suddenly, retail workers are losing their jobs because online shopping explodes. That mall clerk, she didn't do anything wrong. But boom, one day her paycheck's gone, replaced by a website. Every time one of these giant innovations takes off, it sucks people in. It changes lives. So, me for better. So, me for worse. And there's no way to predict exactly how it'll play out. That's the wild thing about transformative ideas. They connect everything at such a deep, fundamental level that once they take off, they're unstoppable. And that, my friends, is how innovation rewires the world. Let me tell you, releasing a big innovation like the shipping container, it's like letting a genie out of a bottle. Once it's out, it's got a life of its own. The person who popped the cork, they've got no idea what the genie's gonna do next. It kicks off this massive chain reaction, and good luck trying to predict where it's all headed. Look at McLean. For the first 10 years, the guy couldn't make a dime off his own invention. He was like a wave crashing on the shore. Splat. Then there were the dock workers. At first, they thought the container was gonna be the death of them. Turns out it was their meal ticket. And the sailors, they finally. So, me modern innovation for us. Yeah, no, their nights at the dockside bars, a poof gone. No more long breaks on shore to kick back and enjoy a drink, or so me company if you catch my drift. See what I mean? Nobody can predict how an innovation will rewrite their future. But let's keep pulling this thread because the container's ripple effects didn't stop there. The third big consequence, it flipped the global manufacturing game completely on its head. The first wave of change came in the 60s and 70s, with containers revolutionizing shipping logistics. But by the 80s, that wave hit manufacturing. Before containers, factories needed massive warehouses to stockpile raw materials. Why? Because getting those materials from port to factory was like playing roulette. When would they arrive? Who knows? Between weather, dock worker strikes, port congestion, and handling delays, you couldn't plan for anything. And without reliable delivery, the only solution was to hoard inventory. And let me tell ya, inventory is every business owner's worst nightmare. Anyone with even a little business experience knows this. It's not how much profit you make on a single product that determines success. It's how fast you can flip your money, how many times you can turn over your cash in a year. That's the key to growing a business. Even the Soviets figured this out, and they were running a planned economy. Back during the Cold War, a Soviet economist famously said, our economy is going to collapse under the weight of its own inventory. Think about it under their system. Have factories didn't get daily deliveries. Nope, they got yearly allocations. The central planners would ship a year's worth of raw materials to a factory all at once. And that factory had to sit on that inventory like a dragon hoarding gold, inefficient. Oh, you bet. Inventory became a ball and chain dragging their entire economy down. But then, bam, containers. Suddenly, the whole game changes. The first company to really get it, a Toyota, those guys, oh, they went wild. They pioneered something called just in time production. And when I say just in time, I mean they took it to the extreme. Forget ordering by the year or the month or even the week. Toyota was placing orders 2 or 3 times a day. They'd call their suppliers whenever they needed more materials, and the suppliers would show up immediately. Here's the craziest part, Toyota's raw material inventory. It was so lean that it was often only enough for an hour of production. Let that sink in. 1 hour. Western automakers who visited their plants were absolutely stunned. Their jaws hit the floor. Trucks would pull up, open a container, and unload materials straight onto the production line. No warehouses, no delays, no wasted space. That's efficiency on steroids. Thanks to the shipping container, Toyota's system was unstoppable. Their cars dominated the US and European markets in the 880s. They crushed their competition. Why? Because they weren't just building cars. They were running a supply chain that was light years ahead of everyone else. And it all started with a humble shipping container. So, here's the thing: by 1984, American capitalists weren't sitting around twiddling their thumbs while Toyota ran circles around them. Oh no, they got smart. There was a stat back then: of the top 500 US manufacturing companies, 40% had adopted Toyota's just in time production model. 40%. They saw the writing on the wall: efficiency is king. And guess what? That boost in efficiency. It all started with the container. Sure, the container only handled transportation, but its ripple effects. It transformed the entire manufacturing game. But here's the kicker: just because America caught on doesn't mean it was all sunshine and rainbows. Oh no. The real magic of the container didn't stop at borders. Its full potential only came out when it went global. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Globalization. That's not new. Heck, we've had globalization since the Silk Road. But back in those days, it was all about luxury goods light, expensive stuff like silk, spices, and porcelain. Why? Because transporting heavy, cheap goods was a logistical nightmare. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the British came along with their shiny new steam engines and steel ships. They slashed global shipping costs by 70%. That's how Britain became the world's factory. Suddenly, even bulk goods could go global. Kerosene from Standard Oil, lighting up remote villages in developing countries. Boar bristles from farmers, used to make paintbrushes for the US Navy. That's right. Pig hair was a strategic military resource. Wild, right? What this did was level the playing field. Countries that lacked resources suddenly had access to everything they needed. The ocean, it became a giant highway, making global trade dirt cheap. If you had the labor to make stuff, you could compete. Globalization kicked into high gear. And here's the thing: when shipping containers came onto the scene in the 60s and 70s, they took that globalization and cranked it up to 11. By the 80s, we weren't just talking about a global market, we were talking about global production. The whole planet turned into one massive assembly line. Products that used to be made start to finish in one location, not anymore. Now, the value chain could be sliced and diced into a million little pieces, with each part outsourced to wherever it could be done cheapest or fastest. Think about that. Every country, every industrial zone suddenly had a role to play. Each region could specialize in what it did best, tapping into its unique advantages. And you know what economists say: specialization drives efficiency. The more finely tuned the division of labor, the more explosive the productivity. Take the iPhone, for example. People love to complain about how China only gets a tiny of the profits from assembling iPhones. But let's be real. Without that hyper efficient global supply chain, China wouldn't even get that slice. The container didn't just change how goods moved, it reshaped the entire economic playing field. The world didn't just get smaller, it became one giant humming interconnected machine. And that machine, it's powered by steel boxes. So now workers in developing countries, armed with nothing but their hardworking hands and sharp skills, get to join the global economy. They're landing jobs, putting food on the table. How's that not a good thing? And let's be real, take the iPhone for example. Can you honestly say it's a made in China product? Not so fast. The chip, that's from Taiwan. The Japamra, the CPU, designed by Apple. Sure, the final assembly happens in China, but the finished product, it's sold everywhere. And guess what ties all those pieces together? Containers. This isn't just about smartphones, it's planes too. Think about Boeing. Can you say a Boeing plane is made in America? Not a chance. It's global manufacturing, baby. Parts come from all over the world. Heck, so developing countries are even in the business of shipbreaking. These guys take apart old ships, melt down the metal, and they're like, I have no clue what this chunk of steel is gonna be used for. For all I know, I might have just helped build something for another country's military. And if there's another world war, well, let's just hope nobody blames the scrap metal guys. Now, here's something wild. Those massive container ships crisscrossing the Pacific or the Atlantic. They're not full of finished goods. Nope, most of what they're hauling are semi finished products. These ships are like forklifts in a giant global assembly line, zipping parts back and forth between production stages. The world is basically one giant factory now, humming along like a well oiled machine. Here's how tight the system is after 9/11. The US imposed a temporary shipping freeze. And what happened? Within 3 days, Detroit's big three automakers, GM, Ford, Chrysler, had to shut down production. They ran out of parts. That's how lean the supply chain is. Thanks to containers, manufacturers don't need to stockpile massive amounts of raw materials anymore. But if something disrupts that chain, even for a moment, the whole system grinds to a halt. Now, is that a bad thing? Nah. Back in the day, this kind of downtime was just business as usual. Factories regularly ran out of materials. It happened all the time. Now, it takes a catastrophic event like 9/11 to even make a dent. That's progress, folks. But here's the twist. American capitalists didn't see this coming. They thought container driven efficiency would stay within their borders. They figured, we'll just do what Toyota's doing and all the benefits will stay here in the US? Yeah, no. Once globalization kicked in, no single country could monopolize production anymore. The container made the whole world the factory floor. And speaking of unexpected consequences, let's talk about how the container reshaped global economics and politics. Back in the day, where did you build a port? Easy. You put it near manufacturing hubs or big cities. New York, for instance, was America's biggest port for a long time because it had tons of factories nearby. The closer the port was to the factories, the cheaper and faster you could move goods. But New York had its issues. The city's roads were a nightmare, congested and slow. And let's not forget those infamous dock workers. Tough as nails and unionized to the hilt. They'd go on strike at the drop of a hat. Oh, and they had political power too. You think a New York mayor was gonna pick a fight with them? Not if he wanted to keep his job. Nobody dared propose turning New York Harbor into a container only port. But here's the twist, those cities far from the big manufacturing hubs. They suddenly had their moment to shine. Take Seattle, for example. Back in the day, Seattle was this sleepy little port on the Pacific coast, not exactly thriving. But once containers revolutionized shipping, long distance trucking became so efficient that ports didn't have to be right next to manufacturing centers anymore. Seattle, it boomed. And right next to New York, there's Elizabethport in New Jersey. Now, fun fact, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was the one to kick off the whole container revolution in the first place. But in a classic case of irony, New York just sat there and watched as Elizabeth Port took all the glory. Meanwhile, Europe saw the same thing happen. London used to be the king of shipping, the world's maritime capital. But London's dock workers, they went on strike to protest containers. 2 years of strikes, and boom, Rotterdam swooped in. The Dutch said, "Thanks for the head start, London." Rotterdam became the biggest container port in the world for a while, handling a massive chunk of Europe's shipping. And then there's Singapore. Back in the 60s, Singapore was barely a country. It was a glorified military base. But in 1966, right after gaining independence, Singapore's leaders made a bold move. They threw everything they had into building a massive container port. Fast forward to today, and Singapore's port handles more cargo every year than all of France's ports combined. One port. Yeah, containers didn't just move goods. They reshaped the world's geopolitics. Where ports thrived, industries followed. And here's the thing, the container game moves fast. If a country doesn't keep up, they're getting left behind. No second chances. But here's the part that makes you sigh. The brutal truth about these connection based innovations, the people who kickstart them, they often get left behind. Look at the internet. It's the ultimate connection based innovation, right? So, many of the people who helped create it are still alive today. But let's be honest, how much do they have to do with today's cutting edge innovations? Not much. They're in documentaries, they're in history books, they're on stages giving keynote speeches about the good old days. Meanwhile, the internet itself, it's off in the stratosphere, way beyond their reach. And the same thing happened with the shipping container. It was so efficient, so transformative, that it became a magnet for capital and brain power. Everyone wanted a piece of it. And the guy who started it all, Malcolm McLean, you'd think he'd be riding that wave to glory, right? Nope. By the 1980s, just as the container boom was reaching new heights, McLean went bankrupt. Yeah, the father of the shipping container got crushed by the very wave he created. Did Malcolm McLean make so? Me huge mistake. Nah, not really. He just couldn't keep up. The game changed, and it changed fast. By the 80s, everyone knew how much value the shipping container was bringing. But to keep that value growing, you had to build bigger ships, and to build bigger ships, you needed bigger loans. That's where the real power shifted to the banks. Suddenly, shipping wasn't just about boats and cargo, it was about financial leverage. Here's the problem, if the global economy so much as sneezed, the shipping industry got a fever. Why? Because now the ships weren't just sitting assets, they were on the clock racking up interest payments. Every day those massive ships stayed idle, the financial costs piled up. Back in the old days, if a shipowner decided to park their fleet for a bit, no big deal. But now, every extra day was like throwing cash into a bonfire. One economic downturn and, boom, you're sunk. That's exactly what happened to McLean's company. By the 80s, he was bankrupt. In the early 90s, folks tried to honor McLean's legacy by pulling him back into the industry. They built a new shipping company and made him the honorary leader. But let's be honest, it was more of a symbolic gesture. By that time, McLean wasn't running the show anymore. He was older, and the industry had moved on. Now, about these giant ships, I've seen one of those mega container ships in Hong Kong. It can carry 3,000 containers. Back then, that was considered massive. Then came the Panamax ships designed to fit perfectly through the Panama Canal. These beasts could carry over 8,000 containers. And now, we've got the Malacca ships, built to squeeze through the Strait of Malacca. You know how many containers they can handle? 18,000. Let that sink in. 18,000 containers on a single ship. If this trend keeps up, we'll eventually only need a handful of ships and ports to move goods around the entire planet. Just a few key routes and hubs, and the global logistics backbone is sorted. It's efficient, sure, but also kind of terrifying. The stakes are higher than ever. The shipping industry, it's still running this endless marathon. Nobody can afford to stop, not even for a second. And you know what? It's just like AI. The pace is relentless. Everyone's sprinting to stay ahead. You think you're on top now. Great, enjoy it while it lasts, because in a few years, someone else will be wearing that crown. Progress waits for no one. Speaking of which, can we talk about how people love to dunk on innovators when things go wrong? Like when Open AI crashes or screws up, and suddenly all these nobodies come out of the woodwork clapping, Hacha! They failed. Serves them right? What kind of mindset is that? These are the people who risk everything: their time, their resources, their reputations, to bring something new and better into the world. And instead of cheering them on, you're sitting there throwing shade. Please. You know what's inspiring? When McLean passed away on May 30, 2001, every single container ship in the world, no matter where it was docked at a port, crossing the Atlantic, or cruising through the Pacific, sounded its horn in his honor. Every single one. That's the kind of tribute an innovator deserves. That's respect. So, here's my challenge to all of us. Let's show that same respect to every innovator out there. Maybe not with ship horns. We don't all have those handy, but at least in our hearts, let's give them their due. Because without them, this world would be a much duller place.